To prepare the fins for gluing to the body tube, I need to rough up any surface on the fin that's going to be seeing epoxy. This runs all the way from the motor mount to the body tube to the top of the fillet. So what I did was I set a fin into its slot and eyeballed how tall a fillet's going to be, then set masking tape along the top edge of where the fillet's going to be. Since I've already done that on one fin, I simply transferred that height to the other fins, like so, with masking tape. So the actual dimension doesn't matter. What's important is being consistent with all the fins. So I'll do the same now with the last fin. So now with tape applied to the fin, I simply use my sanding block with 60 grit sandpaper and rough up the fiberglass as much as I can. If I can get rid of the shine on the fiberglass, that'll provide for a very strong grip for the epoxy to attach to. Just touching up some of the bare areas here with a little sandpaper by hand, just to make sure I get all of the side area on the fin that will see epoxy. While I'm at it, I'll do the base as well, just to make sure that's nice and rough. With the sanding done, paper towel with some rubbing alcohol to clean up all the fiberglass dust. And the surface is ready for epoxy. To make sure the fins are properly aligned when I glue them onto the Drago body, I've gone to a website called payloadbay.com. They have a number of tools that are useful for rocketry. One of them is the fin guide. All you have to do is enter your body tube diameter, fin span, number of fins, and the thickness of the fin, and you can print out this guide here that you glue to a foam board. Simply cut along the lines, and you can punch out your guide, and this guide's going to go over the body tube, and the fins will fit inside the slots and give perfect 120-degree alignment for a 3-finned rocket. And of course you can change the number of fins in the guide, so if you have 3, 4, 5, 6 fins, whatever, it'll get the spacing just right. With the fins all prepped and the rear centering ring moved back a ways, it's time to start epoxying the fins to the body tube. I've already mixed up some rocket epoxy here, and it's a simple matter of applying epoxy to the root edge of the fin. I'll place it in the slot, wiggle it just a little bit to spread out some of the epoxy, then I'm going to move the fin back out, apply a second layer of epoxy, and then put the fin on permanently. That's called the double butter method, and helps get a better base on the motor mount tube with more epoxy at the base. So here's my first layer of epoxy on the root of the fin. And remember, I won't be applying any epoxy to the rear of the fin because it's not touching the rear centering ring just yet. Nothing on the front as well, because this front centering ring doesn't touch the fins on this model. So we'll stick the fin into position. Make sure it's sitting down. Then just move it just a little bit. Now I'm going to pull the fin back out and apply one more bead of epoxy to the root. There's a second layer of epoxy for the root. That's going to be plenty to make a nice strong joint. It's time to set the root, or the fin, into the body tube, and you can see these pieces of tape here on the body tube, and I've marked where on the body tube the fin needs to go, since it can slide a little bit forward and aft in the slot here. When I had the rear centering ring in position, I moved the fins all the way back to be touching the rear centering ring, and then mark that position with tape, so I know exactly where they're going to be. And you can't see from the camera angle, but from the other side, there's a little bit of epoxy that worked its way onto the body tube, and I don't want that just yet. want to wait until I'm doing fillets for that. So that's why I always keep some paper towels and rubbing alcohol ready when I'm working with a large amount of epoxy like this that might end up where I really don't want it. So we'll just wipe that off real quick. Now with the fin sitting down and in place, I'm just going to move the fin guide into position. This will hold the fin at a perfect angle coming out of the body tube. I cut the slots for the fin length a little bit long, so this guide won't actually push the fin down. So I'll just use a little tape on the fin for that. But when working with one fin at a time, it's actually very difficult to judge with the naked eye whether the fin's sticking out at 90 degrees from the round body tube. The fin guide makes it effortless. You know that it's the right position. Following the steps that I did in the first fin, I attached the next two fins. So all three fins are in place now on the Drago. So I set the fin guide to its final position, and I pushed down on all the fins to make sure they're sitting tight against the motor tube, and ran some masking tape around the front and the back of them all the way around to keep them compressed against the motor tube. With all that done, all I need to do is wait for the glue to dry. Then I can pop the rear centering ring off and begin on the internal fillets and the external fillets. So I just got back from my work trip, which means that these fins have been sitting here for a week. The epoxy is fully cured, and I can tell because here's the rocket epoxy right here, and it's rock solid in the cup that I mixed it in. So now I get to take off all the tape and the fin jig, and then we'll pull off the rear centering ring and have a look at the inside. Now it's tough to tell with the shadowing here, but when I made this fin jig, I cut little tiny notches out of the foam right where the fins intersect the body tube, so that the fin jig shouldn't be glued to the body tube if there's any extra epoxy between the fins and the body tube here. So with any luck, it should just slide right off. Perfect. I can use this fin jig again for another rocket, but it has to be obviously a 4-inch diameter with 3/16-inch thick fins. Here's the rear centering ring. We'll pull that out, and now we can access the inside of the body tube so we can get to the internal fillets. I'm going to get started with the external fillets on the Drago fins. As you can see, I've added tape lines just outside of where the fins and the body tube have been sanded. This will be where I'm going to put the rocket epoxy, and then I also have just a little bit bigger than a 1/2-inch wide popsicle stick. This will give me a nice radius tool so I can drag the fillets, make a nice radius out of the epoxy while it sets. I put together 30 grams worth of rocket epoxy. I'm just going to set this next to my heat lamp here, let it warm up so it's easier to mix up, and then I'll be able to apply the fillets. Okay, with the rocket epoxy mixed up, I've got my small craft stick here. I'm going to use that to spread the rocket epoxy right down the middle of the joint between the fin and the body tube. And at first it's going to look like I don't have enough to complete the fillet, but once I pull the fillets with the larger popsicle stick, it'll really spread the epoxy out well. This is my first time using rocket epoxy. Normally I use Bob Smith epoxy for the fillets, but I wanted to try rocket epoxy this time. I've heard it works pretty well. Rocket epoxy recommends using a tongue depressor or plastic spoon or another fillet pulling tool dipped in a little bit of rubbing alcohol. So I'll try that when I pull the fillets. The tape here is in place mostly just to keep epoxy from going where I don't want it to go. If I leave the tape in place while the epoxy cures, I'll end up with small ridges on the epoxy that'll have to get sanded down. So the plan here is to set the fillets, allow the epoxy to get into what we call the leathery stage where it's just starting to get set, and then I'll remove the tape. This should allow the ridges to come down on their own, be a little bit less sanding work afterwards. Alright, so there's all the epoxy that I've mixed up. It's setting in place on the fin and body tube intersection, and I'm just getting some rubbing alcohol to set on my larger popsicle stick here. So I just put a little bit of alcohol on the popsicle stick, and I'll start running the fillet. I'm just pulling it back towards myself here. And I can actually angle the popsicle stick for a deeper fillet or for one with a larger radius. So right now I'm just trying to spread that epoxy all the way to the tape line. And then at the end here I just kind of smooth it down a little bit too. Come back to the front, start over again, and just keep doing this until I get a nice smooth epoxy fillet. And then the last step is to run one long pull all the way down the fillet to make a nice smooth line. So it looks like I've got the fillets right about where I want them right now. So I'm going to add a little bit more alcohol to the large popsicle stick. And I'm going to do one long pull on each fillet and allow the glue to self-level from there. Right about there. In the front and the back of the fin I can clean up as the epoxy is starting to set. But for the main part of the fillet, along the root of the fin, we're just going to leave that the way it is and let the glue smooth out on its own. Okay, as the epoxy is starting to set now, I'm going to remove the fillet tape and allow the epoxy to cure here for as long as it takes, so when I move the rocket around, the fillets won't be moving. Unfortunately, it's pretty cold in the garage today, so I'll probably leave this to sit all day and then work on the next set of fillets either later tonight or tomorrow. There we go. With all the tape removed, the epoxy is left here to sit the way it is. One thing that's important to remember when doing epoxy fillets is that most epoxies are sandable. So if you have any imperfections, it's not a big deal. You can come back later and clean it up with a little sandpaper. It just works great if you can try and make it as close to perfect as you can on the first try, which means less filling and sanding later if you want to have perfect fillets. Even if you don't want perfect fillets, something like this is good enough for structural strength and even aerodynamics. But when you have a rocket that has perfect fillets, it really looks fantastic at the field. So we'll let this sit, maybe work on something else while we let the epoxy set.
After completing the next two set of external fillets on the Drago, it's time to do the internal fillets. As you can see, I've added some tape right here to prevent some of the epoxy from going into the areas where the centering ring is going to go on. I've mixed up some epoxy and I've heated it up quite a bit to allow it to flow. And all I'm going to do is just gently pour the epoxy down the motor mount tube here, between the motor mount tube and the body tube, and angle the rocket just a little bit and allow it to pour down the joint between the fin and the motor mount tube. So I've already mixed up the epoxy and I've heated it up quite a bit to allow it to flow better. And just very carefully start pouring it down the joint here. And I've got enough epoxy in this cup to do two different fins. So I'll try and do about half and half. And I'm going to keep the rocket mostly vertical to allow the epoxy to flow down the length of the fin while I'm doing the pouring. And then after the pouring, I'm going to pull out a dowel and just really help get that epoxy smoothed all the way down the fin joint. The internal fillets don't have to be perfectly round because you're not going to see them. So the important thing is just to get enough epoxy down the joint to increase the strength. So after I get the epoxy pushed all the way down the length of the fin, I'm going to put the rocket back in its cradle and allow the epoxy to cure while the rocket's horizontal. And the epoxy will self-level while the rocket's in its stand. Alright, with the rocket epoxy poured down the body tube here, I'm just using a long dowel to help kind of push it down the length of the fins. Get it as far down the joint as I can. And now with the glue push out, I'll just do a quick sighting to make sure the glue made it far enough down the joint to provide enough strength, which it did. And I'll just put the rocket back horizontal in its cradle and allow the epoxy to cure. Doing the fillets is a very tedious part of building the booster because all you can do is one set of fillets at a time, and then you have to set the rocket horizontal and let them cure, which can take a while if you're building in the winter and your garage is cold. So while that's happening, I can work on some other projects for the rocket. Before I finish up the fin can and glue on the aft centering ring, I wanted to finish installing the rail buttons. This is what a rail button looks like. We use a rail with a 1/4 inch channel in it for high power rockets. It's much stronger than using a rod. Plus the rail buttons themselves are quite a bit smaller than a launch lug would be. So there's two different ways to install a rail button. One is just using a sheet metal screw or a wood screw straight into the fiberglass, maybe with a piece of a wood block behind it. That's what I've done for the aft button. For the forward button, what I'm going to use is a weld nut or a T-nut right here, glued onto the inside, and it'll stick out, and then I've got a bolt that's going to hold it in place. To install the T-nut, I've mixed up a little bit of epoxy here. Just going to put that around the nut. And what I've done with the nut here is I've just tack glued it onto a long stick with a little bit of super glue. That'll be enough epoxy right there. And I'll simply run the stick into the body tube and out the hole. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the rail button in place and screw it on nice and tight so it pulls the blind nut up against the body tube on the inside. Makes a strong joint for the epoxy. And I'll simply remove the stick, and then I'm going to hang the rocket with the rail button on the bottom so the epoxy inside the rocket smooths out and dries nice and flat. Then we'll get to the aft centering ring and finish up the booster section. Okay, it's finally time to glue on the aft centering ring. I've mixed up some epoxy here, so I'm just going to spread it around the motor mount tube and the inside of the body tube. And I'll also get a little bit of epoxy on the fin tangs on the inside where the centering ring attaches. So I'll just try and be very careful spreading the epoxy here. And it's not going to be perfect, but that's okay. The centering ring fits real tight, so it's going to push this epoxy down when I push it into place. There we go. With all the epoxy in place, I'm going to set the centering ring into position here. Just going to push it down a little bit. Then I'm going to remove the screws. And I'll come back later and I'm going to fill in the holes made by the screws here with some epoxy. But before I do that, I'm going to get rid of them. Then I'm going to take my motor retainer and just use that to push the centering ring all the way down and into position. With the centering ring in position, I'm going to remove the retainer. And I'm just going to add a few drops of super glue around the edge of the centering ring just to hold it into position. I don't want to add too much super glue here because I'm going to come back and do an epoxy fillet later. But right now what I want to happen is I want internal epoxy fillets to form. And so to do that, I'm going to set the rocket upright. Just like so. Now as the epoxy dries, it'll flow back down onto the centering ring and make a nice internal fillet. Then I'll come back later and I'll add the external fillet and the retainer ring. I've given some time for the epoxy to set on the inside of the centering ring, and so now it's time to make a fillet on the outside of the centering ring. So I've just mixed up some rocket epoxy here, and I'll do a nice fillet on the outside of the ring. And I'm going to make a two-step process out of this. The first step will be doing the fillet, and the second part is going to be actually gluing in the motor retainer. This way I can push the retainer into position while the epoxy is still pliable. Won't have to worry about any epoxy getting in the way of installing the retainer. So I'm just going to go around the outside ring here very carefully with the rocket epoxy, and also try and fill in the holes that I drilled earlier. Once I'm done, then I'll mix up some JB Weld and I'll install the motor retainer. Before the epoxy fillet has had a chance to cure, I'm going to epoxy on the motor retainer. The standard glue to use for the motor retainers and rocketry is JB Weld because it has high heat resistance. So even though the motor will get real hot, the JB Weld should hold nice and tight, prevent the motor from falling off if you're using an injection charge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spread some of the JB Weld on the motor mount tube itself and not the inside of the retainer. And that'll prevent the JB Weld from bunching up and ending up spreading out inside the motor tube, which is not really what you want. So I'll just make a ring around the motor tube here, try and spread it thin, and then we'll get the retainer on. So there's a nice ring of JB Weld on the motor tube. So just make sure you get the right part of the retainer to put on. You don't want to put it on upside down, then you'll never be able to get to the threads to hold the motor in place. And in just one motion here, just going to slightly twist the retainer as I push it down. That'll help spread out the JB Weld a little bit more. I'm just going to push it all the way down onto the centering ring. And when I do, it'll push the JB Weld out and make its own nice little fillet down there. I can feel that tightening up already, and it's nice and tight up against the centering ring. And so before I walk away, I'll just make sure that none of the JB Weld ended up inside of the motor tube, because this is obviously the best time to wipe that up if that happened. And that looks great. So I'll just let that cure the way it is, and that should finish up the booster section, except for just a little bit of sanding on the fillets, which won't be a problem. I'll talk about that a little bit later when we get closer to paint prep. As you can see, I've started sanding one of the fillets here. Haven't started on this one yet, but that's more of a paint prep. Other than that, this completes the booster section, and it's time to get started on the upper section of the rocket.